A Patriot missile interceptor costs somewhere between $3 and $4 million. A single Shahed drone costs roughly $30,000. For every dollar Iran spends building one of these things, it costs its enemies $20 to $28 to shoot it down. That asymmetry, that grotesque imbalance in the economics of modern warfare, is perhaps the most concise summary of how the Islamic Republic has managed to turn 4 decades of international isolation into a military doctrine that now keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. Because Iran didn't become a military power in spite of sanctions. In many ways, it became one because of them. And to understand how that happened, you have to go back to a moment when Iran had nothing. No allies, no weapons pipeline, no domestic industry worth mentioning. So just a revolutionary government, a crumbling military, and an enemy army pouring across its western border. September 22nd, 1980. Iraqi tanks rolled across the Shatt al-Arab waterway and into Iranian territory. Saddam Hussein, backed by billions in Gulf Arab financing and armed to the teeth with Soviet and French hardware, expected a quick victory. Iran was in chaos. The revolution that had toppled the Shah just 18 months earlier had gutted the military's officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders had been purged, jailed, or executed for their ties to the old regime. The Air Force, once the most powerful in the Persian Gulf, with over 400 American-built combat aircraft, was grounded. Not because the planes didn't work, but because there was nobody left to fly them and no way to get spare parts. The United States, furious over the embassy hostage crisis, had slammed an arms embargo on Iran that cut off every bolt, every turbine blade, and every radar component the military depended on. Iran was, in the most literal sense, fighting a modern war with its hands tied behind its back. What happened over the next 8 years would scar an entire generation and reshape the country's military philosophy forever. The Iran-Iraq War killed somewhere around 1 million people on both sides. Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and civilians alike, and the international community largely looked the other way. Iraqi-modified Scud missiles rained down on Tehran during the infamous War of the Cities in 1988, when Baghdad launched roughly 189 missiles at Iranian population centers over a 6-week stretch. The attacks triggered mass panic. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled the capital, and Iran, lacking the air power or missile capability to respond in kind, could only fire back with a handful of Scud Bs it had purchased from Libya. That helplessness left a scar deeper than any bomb crater. Iranian leaders drew 2 conclusions from the war that would define everything that followed. First, nobody was coming to help. The international community had watched Iraq gas Iranian soldiers and shrugged. The United Nations Security Council had effectively condoned the bombardment of Iranian cities through its silence. Iran could rely on no one but itself. Second, if Iran couldn't match its enemies plane for plane and tank for tank, so it would have to find another way to fight. It would have to go asymmetric. The seeds of Iran's modern military machine were planted in the rubble of that war. In 1989, the newly unified Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics launched an ambitious rearmament program. Between 1989 and 1992, Iran spent an estimated $10 billion on weapons, purchasing what it could from Russia and China now that the Soviet Union was collapsing, and Beijing was eager for hard currency. Submarines, fighter jets, artillery systems. But Iran's leadership understood that buying weapons from abroad was a temporary fix. Foreign suppliers could be pressured, embargoed, or simply change their minds. The only lasting solution was self-sufficiency. And so began one of the most underappreciated industrial projects of the late 20th century. Iran's Defense Industries Organization, originally a modest operation capable of producing little more than small arms, started reverse engineering everything it could get its hands on. Soviet RPG-7s, BM-21 rocket launchers, surface-to-air missiles. If it came through the door, Iranian engineers took it apart, studied it, and figured out how to build their own version. The process was painstaking, often crude, and it produced weapons that were frequently inferior to the originals. But it worked, and over time, the quality improved. The missile program was the crown jewel. Iran's pursuit of ballistic missiles actually predates the Islamic Revolution. Under the Shah, Iran had partnered with Israel on a short-range missile system called Project Flower after Washington refused to sell Lance missiles. But the revolution killed that program, and it wasn't until Iraq started lobbing Scuds at Tehran that the new regime realized it desperately needed its own long-range strike capability. Iran bought Scud Bs from wherever it could find them: Libya, Syria, North Korea. And then it started building its own. The Shahab-1 was essentially a domestically produced Scud-B with a range of about 330 kilometers. The Shahab-2 extended that to 500. By the late 1990s, Iran had tested the Shahab-3, a medium-range ballistic missile based on North Korean technology, with a range of roughly 1,300 kilometers. For the first time, Iran could threaten targets deep inside the territory of any regional adversary. But raw range wasn't enough. The early liquid-fueled missiles were slow to set up, inaccurate, and vulnerable to preemptive strikes. So Iran pivoted. It began investing heavily in solid-fuel technology, which produces missiles that are more compact, faster to launch, and harder to detect. The Fateh 110 family of short-range missiles, first tested in the early 2000s, represented a quantum leap in precision. When Iran fired Zulfiqar missiles at the American base at Ain al-Assad in Iraq, in January 2020, in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the accuracy stunned Western analysts. These weren't the wildly inaccurate terror weapons of the War of the Cities. They hit specific buildings. And if you're wondering how all of this connects to the drone that crashed into the sand near Dubai, don't worry, we're getting there. The thing about sanctions is that they're designed to prevent a country from acquiring what it needs from the outside. So the logic is straightforward. Cut off access to advanced technology, and the target country's military capabilities will wither. But sanctions have a paradox built into them. When they last long enough, they stop being a temporary pressure tool and become a permanent feature of the landscape. And when that happens, the target country doesn't just sit there and accept decline. It adapts, it innovates, it finds workarounds, and sometimes it builds something entirely new. Iran's drone program is the single best illustration of this phenomenon. It started in the 1980s during the war with Iraq, when Iranian military units began strapping commercial cameras to radio-controlled model aircraft to surveil the front lines. It was improvised, almost comical in its simplicity, but it worked. And from that crude beginning, Iran built what is now one of the most prolific and battle-tested drone programs on the planet. The turning point came on December 5, 2011, when Iranian forces captured an American Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drone near the city of Kashmar in northeastern Iran. The circumstances of the capture remain disputed. Iran claims its cyber warfare unit jammed the drone's communications, spoofed its GPS coordinates, and guided it to a controlled landing on Iranian soil. American officials have expressed skepticism about this account, suggesting the drone may have simply malfunctioned, but the result was undeniable. Iran had a largely intact, cutting-edge American stealth drone sitting in a hangar, and its engineers immediately went to work. Within a year, Iran claimed it had extracted data from the drone's systems. By 2014, it unveiled what it said was a reverse-engineered copy. By 2016, it had produced an armed variant called the Sayakeh. When Israel shot down an Iranian drone that had entered its airspace in February 2018, Israeli Air Force officers confirmed that the aircraft's design was indeed based on the RQ-170. Iran had taken America's most sophisticated surveillance drone and turned it into a weapon pointed back at America's closest ally in the region. If there was ever a moment that captured the essence of Iran's military philosophy, that was it. And if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the mechanics of power and geography, hit subscribe. At least one of us should get something out of staring at missile specifications for 14 hours straight. But the drone that really changed the game wasn't the Sayakeh. It was the Shahed 136, and it changed the game precisely because it's the opposite of sophisticated. The Shahed is a one-way attack drone, essentially a slow-moving cruise missile made from lightweight materials with a small piston engine driving a rear propeller. It flies at low altitude along pre-programmed GPS routes and detonates on impact. It carries a warhead of roughly 20 to 40 kilograms. Its airframe is built partly from styrofoam. The engine is a reverse-engineered copy of a German civilian aircraft engine, and its electronics are overwhelmingly composed of commercially available off-the-shelf components from American, European, and Asian manufacturers, none of which are classified as military goods. In other words, when Iran built a weapon of war out of parts you could theoretically order online, and it works. Russia proved that. When Moscow invaded Ukraine in February 2022 and quickly discovered it lacked the drone capability for sustained long-range strikes, it turned to Tehran. By November 2022, Russia had purchased the technology and approximately 6,000 Shahed units for an estimated $1.75 billion. Russia renamed them Geran 2 and began launching them at Ukrainian cities and infrastructure infrastructure by the thousands. The telltale buzz of their propeller engines became so ubiquitous in Ukrainian skies that civilians started calling them mopeds. By early 2026, Russia had launched tens of thousands of Shahed-type drones against Ukraine. Iran didn't just sell Russia weapons. It transferred engineering documentation and production tooling, enabling Moscow to establish its own domestic production line at a facility in Tatarstan. The strategic implications of this are staggering. Iran, a country under some of the most comprehensive sanctions in the world, became an arms supplier to one of the world's largest militaries. And the weapon it supplied isn't some niche curiosity. It's a system that has fundamentally altered the economics of modern air defense. Because while a single Shahed costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000, the interceptor missiles used to shoot them down can cost 10 times that or more. Iran figured out how to make its enemies bleed money by spending almost nothing. But missiles and drones, as impressive as they are, represent only one dimension of Iran's military power. The other dimension is human, or rather, it's a network of humans spread across 7 countries, armed, trained, and funded by Tehran, collectively known as the Axis of Resistance. The IRGC's Quds Force, the elite external operations arm of the Revolutionary Guards, serves as the hub of this network. With an estimated annual budget of $1 to $2 billion for proxy operations, the Quds Force coordinates, funds, trains, and arms allied groups from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq to Gaza. The model is brilliantly simple in concept and fiendishly complex in execution. Rather than deploying Iranian soldiers abroad, Tehran cultivates local forces that share its strategic interests and equips them to fight on Iran's behalf. The result is that Iran can project power across the entire Middle East without the political cost of body bags coming home. Hezbollah in Lebanon is the crown jewel, the most capable non-state armed group in the Middle East, with an estimated arsenal that once included over 150,000 rockets and missiles and between 30 and 50,000 trained fighters. The Houthis in Yemen demonstrated they could disrupt global shipping through the Red Sea with anti-ship missiles and drones, forcing freight companies to reroute around Africa and sending insurance premiums through the roof. Iraqi Shia militias trained by the Quds Force conducted attacks against American forces for years. The degree of Iranian control varies by group, with Hezbollah being the most tightly integrated and the Houthis operating with greater autonomy. But the effect is the same. Iran has made itself impossible to confront without simultaneously dealing with half a dozen other conflicts. This is what makes the Iranian military story so fundamentally different from anything else in the modern world. Most countries build military power by acquiring the best technology they can afford. Iran built military power by developing the cheapest technology that works and then distributing it as widely as possible. Most countries measure military strength in aircraft carriers and stealth fighters. Iran measures it in the number of fronts it can open simultaneously and the cost ratio between its weapons and its enemy's defenses. Most countries invest in defense to protect their territory. Iran invested in offense to make attacking it prohibitively expensive, and the numbers tell the story. Iran's military budget in recent years has been approximately $7.9 billion. Saudi Arabia spends roughly 8 times that. Israel spends several times more. The United States spends more than 100 times more. Yet Iran, ranked among the top 15 military powers globally, has built the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East, deployed drones that have been used in combat across multiple continents, and maintained a proxy network that has reshaped the security architecture of the entire region. Dollar for dollar, it may be the most efficient military investment any country has made in the 21st century. There's an irony buried in all of this that's almost too perfect. The sanctions that were supposed to cripple Iran's military capabilities actually forced it to develop the exact kind of military that sanctions can't easily stop. You can embargo advanced fighter jets. You can block the sale of sophisticated radar systems. You can sanction banks and freeze assets. But you can't easily sanction styrofoam, piston engines, and GPS modules. You can't embargo the knowledge of how to reverse engineer a drone. And you certainly can't sanction a military doctrine that says, we don't need to be stronger than you. We just need to make fighting us more expensive than you're willing to pay. The June 2025 war with Israel laid bare both the power and the limits of this approach. Iran launched hundreds of ballistic missiles at Israeli targets, on some of which managed to breach Israel's vaunted missile defense systems. Israel and the United States struck back hard, hitting nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and military leadership targets. Iran sustained significant damage, but the missiles kept coming. The drones kept flying, and within months, intelligence sources reported that Iran was already working to replenish its stockpile, receiving large shipments of rocket fuel precursors and rebuilding production at dispersed, hardened facilities, many of them buried deep underground in what Iran calls its missile cities, bunker complexes at depths of up to 500 meters, designed to survive even bunker-buster strikes. That resilience isn't an accident. It's the entire point of Iran's military architecture. The parallel army structure, with the regular Artesh handling conventional defense, and the IRGC controlling missiles, drones, proxies, and asymmetric operations, means there's no single center of gravity to destroy. The underground missile cities mean that even sustained aerial bombardment can't eliminate Iran's strike capability in a single blow. The proxy network means that hitting Iran directly triggers responses from Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and beyond. It's a military designed not to win wars in the traditional sense, but to make wars against Iran unwinnable in any meaningful strategic sense. The man often called the father of Iran's missile program was Hassan Tehrani Moghadam, an IRGC general who spent decades developing the country's ballistic missile capability, largely in secret. In a handwritten letter to Supreme Leader Khamenei, dated December 2005, Moghadam reported that his team had begun work on what he called the ultimate Israel striker and deterrent rapid reaction hypersonic missile. He was killed in a mysterious explosion at a missile facility in 2011. The program continued without him. In June 2023, Iran unveiled the Fatah, a missile it described as hypersonic, capable of maneuvering at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Whether it fully meets the technical definition of a hypersonic weapon remains debated by Western analysts. What isn't debated is the trajectory. Iran's missiles have gotten steadily more accurate, more survivable, and more numerous with each passing decade. And now Iran is marketing its weapons abroad. The Shahed 149, a long-endurance combat drone with a stated range of roughly 2,500 miles, and the ability to carry up to 12 precision-guided munitions, is being pitched to buyers across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia as an affordable alternative to Western and Chinese systems. Iran is competing directly with Turkish and Chinese drone manufacturers for market share in a rapidly expanding global drone market. A country that couldn't build its own spare parts 40 years ago is now an arms exporter. The sanctions didn't prevent any of this. In some ways, they accelerated it. By forcing Iran to develop indigenous capabilities, the sanctions created a military-industrial base that is now largely self-sustaining. By consolidating economic power in the hands of the government and the IRGC, the sanctions channeled more resources toward military production. So by cutting Iran off from the global financial system, the sanctions pushed Tehran into partnerships with Russia and China that provided both markets for Iranian weapons and sources for the components Iran still needs to import. The comprehensive economic isolation that was supposed to bring Iran to its knees instead taught it to stand on its own feet, build its own weapons, and fight its own way. That doesn't mean Iran is invulnerable. Its air force remains one of the weakest in the region. A flying, aging American FOF-4 Phantoms and FOF-4 5 Tigers from before the revolution, alongside a handful of Soviet-era aircraft. Its conventional navy can't match any major regional power in open water. Its economy is battered by inflation, corruption, and the cumulative weight of decades of isolation. Popular unrest simmers beneath the surface. The June 2025 war exposed real vulnerabilities, and the loss of the Assad regime in Syria deprived Tehran of a critical corridor for arms transfers to Hezbollah. Iran's military strength is real, but it exists within a shell of profound economic and political fragility. And that's the tension at the heart of this story. Iran has built a military machine that can threaten its neighbors, disrupt global shipping, supply weapons to a superpower's war effort, and absorb punishing strikes without losing its ability to retaliate. But it did so at extraordinary cost to its own people, who bear the burden of sanctions, economic mismanagement, and a government that prioritizes rockets over roads. The same Revolutionary Guard that builds missiles also controls vast economic enterprises. The same budget that funds proxy networks could fund schools and hospitals. The same doctrine that makes Iran hard to attack also makes it hard to live in. Iran didn't fail, it adapted. Sanctioned. Whether that adaptation was genius or tragedy depends entirely on where you're standing when the drones fly overhead. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It really makes a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on GlobeWhy.